This episode is brought to you by Lamb Solutions. Elevate your stay with luxury vacation rentals in Tanzania and Senegal. Africa is the place to be, with her vibrant culture and breathtaking beaches. And your stay will be most unforgettable with the best home away from home. Think private pools, gyms, concierge services, and more. It's comfort and luxury in one. Are you a property owner? You might be missing out on hands-free income. Lamb Solutions can handle your short-term rental business for you. From listings, guest relations, to maintenance, now you can earn more and stress less. Visit lamb-solutions.com to book your next getaway or schedule your property management consultation. Your stay, your story, our expertise.
Greetings, and welcome back to your favorite podcast, The Africanist. I am your host, Bambajai, and it is a pleasure to be back with another episode and with another special guest to discuss an important current event happening on the African continent. So we hope you all are doing well and that you're enjoying your summer. And today I have the pleasure to co-host this episode with a very special person. His name is Lucas Perez. Lucas is one of my favorite students. He's also my research assistant this summer, and he also has edited a couple of the episodes that we've done this summer, and he's doing a great job. So Lucas Perez is a third-year political science student at Emory University. He's a rapper, a producer, an audio engineer, and currently interning at German Dupree's So Deaf Recordings. In addition to his music work, he serves as the lead editor and audio engineering for this podcast, as I said earlier. So making sure that the episode sounds clean and connects with the audience. Lucas, it's a pleasure to co-host this episode with you.
Thank you, Professor Najai. Today's episode of the Africanist podcast takes us to Kenya, where a new generation of youth-led protests is pushed back against corruption, austerity, and police violence. From online mobilization to mass demonstrations, the movement has raised big questions about democracy, civil liberties, and what accountability looks like. We'll be digging into all of that today. Joining us is Wairimu Gathimba, a writer and researcher within the Kenyan social justice movement. She's worked on podcasts like Until Everyone is Free and A Certain Amount of Madness, and her recent articles include Kenya at 60, Field Notes from the Neo-Colony and African Arguments, and a powerful piece in review of African political economy on the state-led destruction that followed Kenya's floods. Wairimu, we are really glad to have you here.
Welcome to the podcast, Wairimu.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to start with the first question, Wairimu. Can you walk us through the origin of the recent protest movement in Kenya? What catalyzed the current wave of protests in Kenya as one of the people who is and was on the ground when this was happening?
So I think the first thing people need to realize is that the current crisis, if we can call it that, it didn't start with the Finance Bill 2024, though the Finance Bill served as like this sort of trigger. So in the last 5-7 years, so to say, people have been disillusioned by what one might call the Kenyan political class, because at this point it's become a very identifiable political class with the same sort of characters in and out through the years. So in the last president's regime, his name was Uhuru Kenyatta, for those who might not know, inflation was high, the cost of living skyrocketed. So even in the country, elections have always happened, or voting rather has always happened along these sort of ethnic blocks. But you find that people were so tired of Uhuru Kenyatta and the way things are going in the country, especially in his last term, that's the Mount Kenya voting bloc, which is to say the Kikuyu community, the Gema voting bloc, the Embus and the Embu community, the Meru community. You find that they went with a newer entrance into the political scene, or rather, he's not exactly new because he's been, again, the thing I said about the political class having the same people year in and year out. He's not new, but he was not, to say, as powerful, or like he hadn't gotten to the level of like regional titan someone like Uhuru Kenyatta, the former president, had. He was just at the MP level. His name is Rigathi Gachagua. He was Ruto's running mate. He's since been impeached and he's currently actually in the US. He owns a ranch in Texas, which is wild to own a ranch in Texas, especially like as a foreigner. But so you find that everyone wanted to like vote Uhuru out. In fact, the general sentiment by like aligning with Ruto and Rigathi Gachagua was that we are punishing Uhuru, we want him out because we are suffering. But the elections were, to quote Nanjala Nyabola, like the most boring elections. They recorded like the lowest voter turnout in like the last 15 years. And one block was conspicuously missing from the turnout. And this was the Kenyan youth. And for most people, this looked like an expression of political apathy, voter apathy. But for me, as one of those Kenyan youth who didn't show up for the elections, this was more than anything an expression of disillusionment. So you find that, Ruto won the election. The margin was like rather slim. He won by like 50.7%. But he proceeded to do what I think I'd call squandering the little political legitimacy he had by winning on like such a thin margin. Among the initial things he did on coming to power was like roll back these sort of subsidies that Uhuru had put in place for things like fuel, like maize flour, that, didn't really, like the cost of living was really high, but the subsidies provided some cushioning. So you find that he rolls back things like that. This is in late 22. He talks about the need for austerity, given like the country's debt burden and the need to like tighten our belts, to quote him. That's the term he used. And then like a year or like 8 months later in 2023, mid-2023, around June, when the country's budget is usually red, he introduces these austerity measures. Like you find that VAT on fuel doubled from like 8% to 16%. He introduces a very unpopular housing levy in the name of like an affordable housing project. And, everyone was protesting. Like these are not like, housing is, a rather urgent need for most Kenyans, but it was not the immediate material need people were trying to fill. People were worried about things like food, like healthcare and things like that. He introduces an unpopular housing levy. He doubles the VAT on fuel. He introduces a withholding tax on like money people make on digital platforms. So, we get the sense of like things becoming increasingly untenable. That's 2023. There are protests happening, but these protests are like largely associated with the opposition leader, Raila. So, there are people on the streets, but there's a scapegoat. These are just protests led by the opposition leader. We don't have to take them seriously. So then we get to 2024, same thing, finance bill. And now this is the straw that like breaks the camel back. We have a lot of these ludicrous tax proposals. We have VAT on bread, which has always been like tax exempt. We have VAT on banking services that have already like been subjected to excise duty. He introduces excise duty on things like cooking oil. And then he introduces like an eco tax, an eco levy tax. And this affects the price of goods like sanitary towels and nappies. So before like the reading happens, people like get wind of like these proposals. Again, the Kenya cost of living crisis has been, it's been like something that has been happening since the previous regime. So like for maybe like 4 or 5 years at this point, like the cost of living has been skyrocketing. So at this point, people are like attuned to these policies in a way that they weren't before because they can really feel the crunch. Yes. So we have a lot of backlash on social media. People are trying to engage in public participation. People are like writing emails. A lot of these youth groups like Kwani and Bunge la Mayouths are even offering people like commissioner of odd services, like where you print out the required form that you need to fill out for like the public participation process. They get you lawyers, you stop, and then they collect them and take them to parliament themselves. So it's like unprecedented levels of public participation. But the regime received these things with like a sort of arrogance. You have one of the president's economic advisors, his name is David D, saying things like, you people on social media are like just digital wankers. And he talks about how politics is a contact sport. And, if you want to achieve anything, we have to get involved in the contact sport, as he calls it. I think people like sort of take this to heart. We decide we are going to go to the streets. And the first protests happened on like June 18th last year. And I think it's also important to mention that earlier on in the year, in say end of January, thereabouts, Kenya has a femicide problem. It's maybe a much less discussed problem, but it's something that happens. It's something that exists. There are these femicide protests. People come out, large numbers, in the tens of thousands. And I guess because this femicide protest, we can give them this sort of moral framing rather than a political one. Murder is bad. Everyone agrees. We are trying to talk to make it known that women are people. Again, everyone agrees. So the state does not really get in the way of these protests. In fact, I remember because I was also there for like the femicide protest. We marched through the CBD. We are accompanied by the police. And I think in many ways, this rather smooth protest experience shows a lot of this, for lack of a better word, I think I should call them like protest newbies that, you can come out and protest for a cause and go back home okay. Yeah, they're incited to come out for the June protest. And I think this is why you find that there's a new demographic that shows up for the June protest. This is now the thing that has a lot of international media and even our own politicians themselves framing this protest as like led by an entitled Gen Z class that shows up to protest in Ubers and takes selfies for social media and all that. That now culminates in like the June protest. There are protests on June 18th. The numbers are not really that good. And then there are protests that follow on June 20th. The crowds are even larger. And then now there are the massive protests that happened on June 25th. The people show up in really huge numbers and people storm into parliament. I think people might have seen that on social media or on any of those international news outlets. After coming out to talk about how a lot of the people who went to attack the parliament are like treason as criminals on the night of the 25th, Ruto seems to have this change of heart. I don't know what informs it. But shortly after, he talks about, he makes these sort of concessions. He returns the finance bill after it had been passed through all the necessary readings in parliament, back to parliament, refuses to like sign it into law. He dismisses most members of his cabinet, but eventually like reappoints them. So they're concessions, but they're like rapidly rolled back. Yeah, but that marks the end of that. The attempt of protesting that's happened toward the end, sometime in July and even August, what people are calling Nane Nane, like 8th of August. Nane is 8 in Kiswahili. The police presence in town. I think at this point people are also like rather tired. So the way the protest momentum goes, at some point, the numbers reduce.
Yeah.
So we have what I guess we'll call everything becomes orderly. Yeah. But then what happens is that there's this sort of Ruto begins what I think I can only call like preemptive suppression. So after the protest, after everything has quote unquote settled down, we see this wave of like extrajudicial executions and killings happening, a lot of dissenters getting abducted and things like that. So around June this year, people were already like, there had been talk of people coming out to the protest, like to protest, people coming out for protests as like an anniversary of the historic June 25th protest last year. But shortly before that, a blogger, his name was Albert Ojwang, he gets killed in police custody. The statement that the police will put out is that he banged his head on the cell walls and killed himself. But obviously, that's not really, there's no way that could happen. And the postmortem actually reveals that he was beaten to death. So people are enraged, people come out. Another blogger who developed this digital tool, another web developer rather, not a blogger. Her name is Rose Njeri. She developed this digital tool to like make people to ease in the public participation again that was necessary for the finance bill 2025, which people also had issues with. She also gets arrested, but people catch wind of Rose's arrest early on, and I guess because of public pressure, she gets released. Or doesn't suffer the same fates as Albert Ojwang. So yeah, people come out, but again, preemptive suppression. It's like Ruto seemed to be prepared for this year's protest. Last year, protests seemed to like have caught him off guard, but he seems to have ready this year. Police presence was heavy. Roads to town were blocked. I remember, like on the 25th, when I tried to go to town myself, we got stopped at I don't know if your audience will know this, but along Limuru Road, I like maybe 5 kilometers or so. And to get to town, our matatu actually had to like win through roads that are not public, like through residential estates. And even there, we couldn't get to town. At some point, the matatu drivers were forced to like let us or like get off the matatu, and we had to walk into town.
Yeah.
A lot of the roads were blocked, and most people didn't make it to town. So people still walked to town, and people still protested even along those routes, even if they didn't make it to CBD. So you get a lot of videos of people protesting along Kiambu Road, along Thika Road, and some people who made it to CBD, like myself, still protesting in CBD. But the protests are not as big as last year, and maybe because of this sort of clampdown, these extrajudicial executions and abductions, the protests are not as spirited as they were like in the last year.
Protest fatigue. Okay. Well, thank you for this detailed summary of the origin of the protest movement.
Yeah, I had a question, but because you were kind of talking about the social media aspect of how some protesters are viewed as like entitled and can kind of just go back home. In terms of like, how do you see digital technology shaping the future of activism in Kenya? Is it more of a tool of empowerment for the activists, or would you view it as more surveillance from the government?
Yeah, there have been like a lot of efforts to break down this rather like the finance bill itself. I've seen people make this joke on Twitter about how Ruto's regime is so bad. We're getting to know, or we're getting to learn these things that we didn't know before, like the fact that there's a finance bill that's passed every year, and this finance bill affects the cost of living. And I guess a lot of us have gotten to learn and experience, or learn and have these rather complex bills that we might have not gone through by ourselves because of Twitter spaces. A lot of people, a lot of groups, like Bunge la Mayut, as I mentioned earlier, even the podcast I'm part of, A Certain Amount of Madness, they held these Twitter spaces last year where people just got to come together, discuss, even a lot of the mobilizing, a lot of the setting of the dates for the protests, again, happened on social media, and then people will catch on offline and show up to town. Yeah, but again, social media has also been a tool of surveillance. Someone like Albert Ojwang was a blogger, so his online presence is what made the police come after him. Rose Njeri as well, she tweeted her digital tool. Again, the police got to come after her. But I think the thing I also worry about when it comes to this fixation on the nature of this protest as this youth, middle class Gen Z thing, as I mentioned in like my explanation, and enabled by social media and by digital. And by the digital is what, when I hear people talk about this protest in those terms, I think about this article Rabab El Mahdi wrote in the wake of like the Egyptian uprising in 2011, where she talked about how, the Egyptian uprising was also qualified in the same terms that are being used for our protest. Youthful, mid-class, non-violence, educated youth who like are not employed. But she warns about how when you talk about this protest in this term, we risk orientalizing this protest, but like a reverse orientalism of sorts, where now we are trying to show, or the Western media outlets, and I guess even local actors are trying to depicts this, or it's a way to make this protest like seem palatable to people. We are trying to show that we're just like the West. We are middle class, we are educated, we're using modern tools. When I guess the way the protests actually happen on ground is like rather different. Yes, it's true that there was a new demographic that joined the protest that might have not been political actors before that are of this nature, but the people who actually, I guess, experience the most risk, the people who actually storm into parliament, and the majority of the people who actually come out to the streets are like the subaltern classes who've been doing this before. So I don't know how to feel. I never know how to feel about the fact that people talk about or center the digital and the use of social media so much when talking about the protest.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that there's definitely a risk of falling into what some scholars term the Facebook theory, meaning that these protests in Africa and other places in the global south are powered by digital media. They might play a very important role, but the difference is made on the ground. So I want to come back to the repression. You mentioned it, and Kenya, unfortunately, is conspicuous for extrajudicial killings, abductions, as you mentioned. So what does this kind of repression reveal about the state's attitude towards civil liberties and dissent?
I think it just reveals who the state actually works for, and it reveals the fallacy of those civil liberties, as you call them, I was recently reading Issa Shivji's The Dilemmas of a Radical Lawyer, Do Constitutions Really Matter? And he talks about like borrowing from the thing Lenin says about politics as like a concentrated form of economic power. So he extrapolates that and talks about law as like a concentrated form of politics. Yeah, so when I think about that, again, to go back to what I was saying about who the state is actually in service of, I think we need to think about who the law is actually meant to serve and what the civil liberties. I think civil liberties are just meant to offer people a relative degree of freedom as the state continues carrying out its role in the background as this arbiter of capital, whether it's transnational capital or the political class, by using the state gets to enable own accumulation. I think the thing is that we're just getting to see who the state has always been meant to be in service of. And yeah, civil liberties are like, they're a relatively small degree of freedom. I don't think that's where the real freedom for the people lies. I think, again, going back to that, if politics is like a concentrated form of economic power and law is like this manifestation of politics, if the law does not talk about the economic structures that are like giving rise to the sort of inequality and the sort of unemployment that Kenyans are experiencing, that's then leading them to go to the streets, I am doubtful that the law is in service of the people and these civil liberties offer any sort of freedom for the people. Yeah.
Thank you for that response.
Thank you for that. I was going to ask, over the past year, through the protests, Kenyan youth have faced everything from police violence to media blackouts. In your experience, what's been the biggest misconception about this movement, either inside or outside of Kenya?
The biggest misconception. I think the biggest misconception will be what I was talking about earlier. This depiction of the protest as like led by they're led by the Gen Z, yes, but this fixation on the social media platforms and their usefulness, and yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception. Though I did come across a rather interesting news piece by DW, and they're talking about how the protests are like getting organized, and they mentioned a revolutionary Gen Z movement that has 3,000 members, and I don't know where they got that from, because the protests are still very much in their leaderless against the political class phase. We've not seen or have not experienced very solid political formations come out of that. So I hope that's something that is only mentioned in that news segment. It is not something that's really widespread. But yeah, I think the biggest misconception for me will be that centeredness of the upper middle class Gen Z or the middle class Gen Z. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then as a follow-up to that, in terms of sustaining momentum, what would you say has been the biggest challenge for the movement so far? Because you were mentioning that it's been kind of waning over the past few months.
I think the protest fatigue, most of us, including myself, I have been part of a movement for like the last 3-4 years, beginning 2021. But it's something to get to come up against the states and see how far the state is willing to go in order to defend itself. So I think that causes some disillusionment, some fear, of course, and also just realizing how far we have to go as, I guess the Kenyan social justice movement and any other political formations that exist in Kenya. This realization that our ideas and our organizing still very much exist in like the realm of counter publics, and getting to realize how much of the typical Kenyan imagination is limited by these ideas of constitutionalism, waiting until the elections. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, Wairimu, you mentioned DW earlier about their coverage of the protests, and it brings me to this question: how do international media and neighboring governments perceive or have perceived this the Kenya protest movement, and what role should global solidarity play in this context?
Yeah. I don't know what to think about global solidarity right now. Just even looking at my own position as a Kenyan who's concerned about the genocide in Palestine, who's concerned about the genocide in Congo. Like, as an international, like, or a comrade, someone who thinks of themselves as like a comrade to the population experiencing genocide in these places, and who's still very much powerless, who I just wake up, I see stuff happening on Twitter, I look at the reports of starvation, I see people have been pushed further in Eastern DRC, and I can't do anything. So, that question forces me to think, what would I want people to do? I don't even think at this point I can talk about bearing witness, because we've been bearing witness to like the genocide in Gaza for like 2 years now, and where has bearing witness gotten us? Yeah, so it's a question for me. I'm trying to think for you.
Yeah, but it's more like also, yes, sometimes we might not physically be able to do anything, because circumstances, distance, it's family circumstances, but there are other forms of support. Even if it's just a hashtag free Kenya or hashtag free Senegal, hashtag things like that, it's a form of support that we have seen in other places, like hashtag Black Lives Matter, for instance, when George Floyd was murdered. So not necessarily physically being there, but even if it's like an op-ed that somebody writes to denounce, or statements, although I feel certain type of way about statements, but they're forms of support.
I think the first thing that comes to mind that you mentioned that is that, even locally, there are a lot of mutual aid funds that were set up in support of like the streets, the injured. There was the Peace for Kenya Association, and they had their pay bill. I'm not sure if they have like an international donation link, like a GoFundMe. There was also like a bail fund that was set up for a lot of those protesters that were picked up off the streets. Yeah, but donating to mutual aid funds for sure. Yeah, I guess that's the first thing I can think of.
Yeah, those can be powerful too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Uh-huh.
Thank you for that. I was going to ask, some people argue that protest alone isn't enough unless it translates into policy change. And so for you, what does success look like and your peers when it comes to this new wave of political engagement in Kenya?
It's interesting. With a certain amount of madness, one of the podcasts I'm part of, we recently had an episode with Fadel Kaboub, the Tunisian development economist. And he said something I'm not sure many people would agree with, or especially people who consider themselves radical or revolutionaries. But he said something to the effect of a lot of the change we are seeking out, a lot of the improvement in our material conditions that, is driving us to the streets. It's not stuff that's going to be achieved by activists. It's stuff that needs proper legislation in place. So it's stuff that's going to be achieved by having a people-centered president. And yeah, that kind of stuck with me. So I think real success is first and foremost, just going back to the thing I said earlier about, or the thing Bamba suggested earlier about political protest fatigue, rather, the first success for me would be, for a lot of these people who just came out to the streets for their first times, are just having to encounter the police for the first time as not, a protector of the masses, as I guess, they might have been made to believe their entire lives, but as someone who's meant to put you in line as the state goes on doing its own state things, the first thing I wish for is that people maintain the steadfast political commitment and do not give into disillusionments. People commit to learning and learning, because I'm also learning and unlearning as, this whole wave of protest go, and as I do my organizing work. So yeah, the first thing that I will consider a success is a lot of people just maintaining a steadfast political commitment to liberation. Because I keep thinking about how, and I had this from a Nigerian comrade who was in the country a month ago. They're talking about how after NSAS happened, there was this thing where they're calling Japa, where a lot of young people just, I guess the disillusionment that came with that, they're just leaving the country in droves. So I kind of hope that doesn't happen with us, that this marks a turning point and we become committed to building alternative forms of political power, or, we are disillusioned with the political class. We become committed to building our own political parties. And yeah, so that we can, maybe in 2027 or even 2032, we can front more people-centered candidates that then, drive the sort of policy change that we'd like to see, and I guess reverse some of the things that have happened under the Ruto administration. Recently, he just ended a free education program that has been instituted, that was instituted in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And now people might have to pay for school fees for their children. And, since 2002 up until now, that's 23 years, people have not had to pay for primary school education at least. He also brought in a new higher education funding model that drove fees from, when I was in uni, which is as recently as 2023, we were paying 22,000 Kenyan shillings per semester, but now fees are over 100,000 Kenyan shillings. So yeah, that's, for me, a win looks like actually being able to build political formations that offer a strong alternative to the current political class, and that eventually translates to some policy change that then translates to better material conditions. Yeah.
Are you going to run for public office, Wairimu?
Um,
Are
I
you
think I
thinking
still
about it? You could be the alternative, right?
um I'm okay with supporting currently, and yeah, I think I'm still also in like a very learning and unlearning phase myself. So let me commit to the learning first.
Okay, cool. So my next question is twofold. First, like, what is the current situation now? Um have things calmed down, the protests, and also
Mhm.
how has the protest movement affected you personally as somebody who participated in them and an organizer?
Um, hmm. How are things currently? Things are pretty calm.
You
I don't have no.
right? So
I am in. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, things are pretty calm. There have not been protests. In July at least. Not any that I heard of. And how have protests affected me personally? Oof, I think, um, yeah, it's one thing to like read about the state and its capacities for violence and everything, but it's an entirely different thing to experience it, to see people getting picked up in their houses, and the next thing you hear, someone is dead, or someone is missing. So that's also something I'm reckoning with, and yeah, it's tested what I think I would consider my commitment to, I guess, liberation. Like I'm thinking, wow, yeah, we're up against a formidable enemy, and just trying to think, how do we organize to counter, yeah, this violent state that has showed us that it has this massive capacity for violence. Like, how do we organize around how do you organize around extrajudicial executions, for example? How do you organize around abductions? Yeah, that's where I'm at. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean those are really major concerns, abduction, and it seems like the the state also has a very long reach. I'm thinking of recently,
Yeah.
Boniface Mwangi and his partner, his wife, if I'm not mistaken, getting arrested or slash abducted in Tanzania and being submitted to torture. So it's pretty scary. I'm not even accounting for all those other people who we do not know by name. I mean, Boniface is quite popular. Um,
Yeah.
you have these other people who are there, were at the forefront of the fight and disappeared overnight. And so our hearts goes to those people and their families. So currently, I think the count they said there there has been about a little over 100 um fatalities uh since then. So how do you how are protesters, movement participants, um
Yeah.
protecting themselves in this climate of abductions and um extrajudicial killing? Is there a way that you think people ought to be careful?
I Wow, that's also another hard question for me, because I do believe in the importance of like underground organizing, as we saw for
Mhm.
like movements like the Kenya, which was organizing against Moi and his dictatorship in the 80s and the early 90s. But also, I think at some point you actually have to, and this is what I think I was trying to get at earlier, about trying to move all these ideas and all these attempts at organizing, at actually building political power from, the realm of like counterpublic into, things that like a public can have a huge following. So I believe that at some point you have to come out. So, and I think coming to that, the thing that comes to mind is, a cliche, the thing about being your brother's keeper. Yeah, for a lot of these abductions, people are like there as the abductions are happening and recording and taking pictures of like the police number plates. But what will happen if we actually intervened? Because, and in some cases, actually, when people are getting abducted, they post on social media. What will happen if we decided to like show up and, like, show solidarity in action, not just through hashtags and retweeting and tweeting hashtag free Tunguru, hashtag free Boniface Mwangi. Like, yeah, that's where I'm at. I think actually just showing up and
yeah, definitely. Showing up and make sure that people are aware of these disappearances and abductions. Yeah, that's great.
Unquestioned. Okay, top 3 novels.
Wow. I don't know if it's top for a long time, but the things that come to mind. I just finished reading. I have what I feel like is a book of the year thing going on for me. So for 2025, my book of the year so far is Necessary Fiction. Just came out by Elogosa Osunde. Really nice book.
What's the name again?
Necessary Fiction.
Necessary Fiction. Okay.
Last year, I was a bit late to the Ferrante wave, but I really enjoyed the Neapolitan novels last year. The entire volume, My Brilliant Friend, Those Who Live and Those Who Stay, The Story of a New Name, and The Story of the Lost Child. Read them all in like a span of 3 months. Really good books.
Cool.
Yeah, and I also liked Prodigals by Greg Jackson. It's like an anthology, a bunch of short stories. But I also really enjoyed it. Like, yes, I think those have been my books of the years for like the last 3 years. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Top 3 dishes. What are top 3 dishes that you cannot live without?
I don't consider myself much of a foodie. I think I'm rather boring when it comes to food. But I like palak paneer with naan.
Okay.
Yes. I also like a cheesy sandwich. Just cheese and tomato, nothing complicated. If it's done right, gets to the right spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also like dal curry. Yeah.
Dal curry. Okay. So you big Indian cuisine fan.
Indian, yeah. I'm vegetarian, so
Cannot go wrong with that. Okay.
And then the last one was top 3 places to travel on your bucket list.
I'm thinking Dakar.
Yay! Let's go. Yeah. That's my city. And that's where I'm from.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. You can welcome me when I visit Dakar.
Of course.
Well, I also second place. Let me think. So there's Dakar. There's I'd like to go to Cape Verde. Though the reason for this is I got invited for a conference there, but I couldn't raise funding, so it feels like a missed opportunity. So something I have to make up for. I'm not sure I like the place for like a specific reason. There's just this itch to like make up for the lost opportunity.
Let me tell you, it's a beautiful place. You will, if you go to Dakar, it's just an hour flight to Cabo Verde.
Yeah.
And great islands and very nice people. You will not regret it. Let's put it that way.
Three places. Other place I'd like to go to. Let me think. On the continent, let me just try to keep it on the continent because that seems to be the thing I have going on. I'd also like to go to Lagos. Yeah, love to experience that, the energy. I can't imagine. People say that Lagos is more chaotic than Nairobi, and Nairobi is pretty chaotic. So I'm like, what's that like?
I think that's what many major African cities have in common. Like this organized chaos, but that's where the fun is, in the chaos. Well, thank you so much, Wairimu, for joining on that episode about the protest movement in Kenya. We really appreciate it. Stay strong, be safe in these circumstances. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I hope we will have the opportunity to bring you back to discuss the evolution of the situation. And thank you also to Lucas for the wonderful work you've been doing for the podcast.
Yeah.
All right. So on that note, we give you guys rendezvous very soon for another episode of the Africanist podcast. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy.